In the shadowed belfry of Antwerp's shattered cathedral, a single bronze shard gleams with a secret cavity. Diamonds smuggled through war's chaos, hidden inside bells bound for munitions. When Professor von der Berg vows to expose them during the recasting of the Great Carillon, a midnight quarrel erupts in the glowing foundry. Accusations fly, a scaffold rope is slashed, and 6 tons of molten death crushes the truth-teller beneath the mould. Was it the desperate assistant drowning in debt, the exiled countess guarding her emerald empire, the jovial insurer protecting a fortune, or the trembling hostess preserving her husband's tainted legacy? As anonymous warnings echo like cracked peals and forged telegrams scatter blame, only one quiet English spinster, knitting by the fire, listens to the false notes in every alibi, unravelling a conspiracy of greed, loyalty, and murder before the new bells ring pure or forever tainted. Chapter 1. The Invitation. Miss Jane Marple descended from the Brussels train at Antwerp Central Station with the unhurried composure of one who has never allowed timetables to dictate her temper. The great iron and glass vault above her rang with the muffled clamour of porters and the hiss of steam, yet she paused on the platform, as though listening for a subtler note beneath the din. A faint metallic echo, perhaps the ghost of some distant bell, lingered in the air and made her tilt her head, bird-like, before she gathered her small valise and followed the stream of passengers towards the exit. Outside, the October light lay thin and pale across the square, gilding the facades of the guild halls and striking sparks from the wet cobblestones. A cab drawn by a patient Flemish horse conveyed her along the mere, where shop windows glittered with diamonds arranged like frost on black velvet. Miss Marple observed them with the same mild interest she might bestow upon Mrs. Price's prize dahlias in Willowbrook, though she was perfectly aware that diamonds, unlike dahlias, had been known to excite passions of a less innocent sort. The Grayson residence stood at the finer end of the avenue, a tall, narrow house of pale stone, its windows framed in wrought iron, twisted into the shape of lilies. The door opened before the cab had fully halted, and Mrs. Euphemia Grayson appeared on the step, thinner than Miss Marple remembered from their brief London encounter 20 years earlier, but still trailing the faint scent of violet cassius and nervous agitation. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Grayson clasped both of Miss Marple's hands as though they were lifebuoys. "You cannot imagine what a comfort it is to see a sensible face amid all this continental bustle. Come in, come in, the others are already arrived, and the Professor is holding forth in the drawing-room as if he were ringing the changes on the carillon itself." Miss Marple permitted herself to be divested of her travelling cloak and ushered through a hall papered in subdued gold. A grandfather clock ticked with the solemnity of a verger. Somewhere above, a maid's footsteps crossed the landing and vanished. In the drawing-room, a coal fire burned with well-bred restraint, and 5 persons turned to inspect the newcomer. Professor Emil van der Berg rose first. He was tall, bearded, and wore his learning like a ceremonial sash across a slightly stooping chest. "Miss Marple," he said, bowing with Teutonic precision, "your fame as an observer of the human comedy has preceded you even to the belfries of Antwerp." "Hardly fame, Professor," Miss Marple replied, settling into the chair Mrs. Grayson pressed upon her. "Merely the habit of noticing what is under one's nose. In a village, one has little else to do." Young Mr. Lucian Hale, The professor's assistant gave a short laugh that did not quite reach his eyes. He was dark, thin, and restless. The knot of his tie had already surrendered to the informality of the afternoon. "In Antwerp we notice what is under other people's noses," he said, "especially if it glitters." Countess Irina Petrovna, seated upon a brocade sofa, lifted one eyebrow at this. She was a woman of indefinite age, but definite presence. White hair coiled like a crown, emeralds at her throat that flashed green fire whenever she moved. "Glitter is vulgar, Mr. Hale," she observed in a voice that at once commanded serfs. "True value lies in resonance, what the bell says when it is struck." Mr. Reginald Forbes, the remaining guest, boomed agreement from the hearthrug. He was built on the scale of a Rubens burgomaster, waistcoat straining over a watch chain thick enough to anchor a canal barge. "Resonance, capital! Though I confess, Countess, I prefer my resonance set in platinum and priced by the carat." Mrs. Grayson fluttered between them, pouring tea from a silver pot that trembled slightly in her grasp. "The bells, Jane, the bells are why we're all here. The great carillon of the Cathedral of Our Lady was shattered in 44. Shards everywhere, poor things. Now the city is recasting them, and Emile, Professor van der Berg, has been appointed to oversee the alloy. Such an honour! We are to visit the foundry tomorrow and hear the first trial pouring." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea the colour of mahogany and exactly the temperature she preferred. "I have always thought bells remarkably truthful," she murmured. "They cannot pretend to a note they do not possess." The professor inclined his head. "Precisely, madam. Yet truth requires purity of metal and precision of craft. There have been difficulties." His gaze flicked toward Hale, who was staring into the fire as though it owed him money. Dinner was announced before the difficulties could be elaborated. In the dining room, crystal and candlelight multiplied the company into a small army of reflections. The conversation flowed like the Scheldt at flood tide, the professor on acoustical harmonics, the countess on the imperial bells of Zarskasilo, Mr. Forbes on the soaring insurance premiums for ecclesiastical bronze. Miss Marple listened, her fork moving with methodical grace through a waterzoo rich with cream and tarragon, and noted the small discords beneath the harmony. Mr. Hale drank rather more claret than his youth warranted, and twice contradicted his employer on matters of metallurgy. The Countess's fingers strayed often to her emeralds, as though reassuring herself of their continued existence. Mrs. Grayson's laughter came a fraction too late, like an echo in an empty nave. Only Mr. Forbes appeared entirely at ease, carving the guinea fowl with the flourish of a man who has never doubted his place at any table. When the ladies withdrew, Miss Marple lingered in the hall to admire a small fragonard above the console. Mrs. Grayson joined her, lowering her voice. "You will think me fanciful, Jane, but there is something amiss. Emile has been receiving anonymous letters, warnings, I think, about the new bells. And Lucien, well, he is not happy in his position. Debts, I fear." "Debts are fertile soil for many weeds," Miss Marple said gently. "But weeds, my dear Euphemia, are often no more than symptoms of a deeper disturbance in the garden." Upstairs, in the guest chamber prepared for her, Miss Marple unpacked her nightgown and her knitting. From the window, she could see the cathedral's lacework spire pricking the night sky. Dark now, but tomorrow to be the scene of such resonant enterprise. She drew the curtains, sat upon the bed, and took up her needles. The wool slipped through her fingers with the familiar rhythm of prayer. Somewhere in the house, a door closed with unnecessary firmness. Footsteps crossed the landing and descended the stairs. Miss Marple knitted on, counting stitches, counting also the small telltale silences that fall between human bells when they are not quite in tune. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Cathedral. The following morning broke with a pale Flemish sun that seemed to apologize for its own timidity. A thin mist clung to the Scheldt and drifted in ribbons through the narrow streets, muffling the clop of hooves and the cries of the milk carts. Miss Marple, who had slept as soundly as conscience allows, came down to breakfast at 8:15 to find the dining table already half deserted. A single kipper lay cooling on the professor's plate. The Countess's coffee cup bore the crimson imprint of her lips. Mr. Forbes had left a crumb-strewn vacancy and the lingering aroma of Havana tobacco. Mrs. Grayson, presiding over the chafing dishes with the air of a nervous hen, greeted her guest with relief. "Everyone is so impatient to be off to the cathedral, Jane." "Emile insists we must inspect the fragments before the foundry opens at 10. He has arranged a private key. Such a privilege." Her voice trembled on the word privilege as though it might bite her. Miss Marple helped herself to a modest portion of eggs and a slice of bread still warm from the baker's basket. "Privileges," she observed, "are like church keys. They open doors, but one must still mind what waits behind them." At 9 o'clock the party assembled in the hall. The professor carried a leather portfolio bulging with diagrams. Mr. Hale nursed a cigarette whose smoke curled like a question mark. The Countess wore a sable stole, despite the mildness of the morning, and Mr. Forbes had exchanged yesterday's waistcoat for one embroidered with tiny silver fleur-de-lis that winked whenever he breathed. A motor car, hired for the occasion, conveyed them the short distance to the Groenplatz, where the Cathedral of Our Lady rose in a fretwork of Gothic stone, its single completed tower pointing toward heaven like an admonitory finger. They entered by the south transept door, where a verger in a rusty black cassock admitted them with the air of one who has long since ceased to be impressed by either piety or rank. Inside, the vast nave lay in cool shadow, pierced by shafts of coloured light that slid across the flagstones as the sun climbed. Scaffolding climbed the walls like the rigging of some stone ship. Dust motes danced in the beams, and from the crossing came the faint metallic complaint of tools at work. Professor van der Berg led the way with the stride of a man who considers cathedrals merely larger classrooms. The carillon, he announced, comprised 47 bells before the bombardment. The bourdon, our great Maria, weighed 6 tons and sounded E-flat. Shattered, alas, into more than 300 fragments. Come. He conducted them beneath the crossing to a side chapel screened by canvas. Behind it stood wooden crates, each stenciled in black, Frag, Carillon, 1944. The lids had been removed, revealing nests of straw in which lay jagged pieces of bronze, some no larger than a crown piece, others the length of a man's forearm. The metal was dull green with verdigris, yet here and there a cleaner fracture caught the light and gleamed like a secret. Miss Marple bent over the nearest crate. The fragments smelled of earth and old smoke. She lifted a shard the size of her palm. It was surprisingly heavy, and along one edge ran a hairline crack that had once been a soldered seam. "Curious," she murmured. "One would expect war damage to be more haphazard." The professor's beard twitched with approval. Precisely, Miss Marple. These bells were not merely struck. They were deliberately fractured. The Germans removed them in 44, ostensibly for recasting into munitions, but rumour persists that certain cavities were hollowed beforehand, cavities suitable for concealing items of portable value. Mr. Hale gave a short, uncomfortable laugh. Rumour, Professor? You have been listening to the dockyard gossips again. The Professor's eyes narrowed. I listen to metallurgy, Mr. Hale, and metallurgy tells me that some of these fragments contain trace elements not native to 17th century bronze. Platinum, for example, iridium, substances that do not arrive by accident. Countess Petrovna, who had been examining a shard through a tiny gold lorgnette, let the glass snap shut. In Russia, she said, we hid the imperial eggs inside some of ours. Bells would have been vulgar, but effective. Her tone suggested that effectiveness was a quality she both admired and feared. Mr. Forbes rubbed his hands together, producing a sound like dry leaves. Effective indeed. A single diamond of the first water tucked inside a bell could travel from Antwerp to Buenos Aires without exciting customs. I have handled less ingenious smugglers. Mrs. Grayson gave a small, distressed bleat. But the bells are sacred. The cathedral chapter would never— The cathedral chapter, the professor interrupted, was under occupation. Sacredness is a luxury in wartime. He turned to a trestle table where tools lay in orderly rows. Calipers, a jeweller's loop, a tiny crucible still bearing the ghost of molten metal. We are testing each fragment. So far, 3 have yielded cavities lined with lead foil. Classic concealment technique. Miss Marple replaced her shard with care. And the new bells? She asked mildly. Will they be cast pure? Pure as science can make them, the professor replied. Modern alloys, precise ratios. The first pouring is scheduled for tomorrow, but the old metal must be accounted for, every gram. Insurance, you understand. Mr. Hale stubbed his cigarette on the sole of his shoe and dropped the butt into a crate, earning a glare from his employer. Insurance, he echoed. Always insurance, as if bronze could replace to history. The professor's voice sharpened. History, Mr. Hale, is not served by carelessness. Yesterday, you mislabeled an entire crate. If you cannot, I labelled it exactly as you instructed. Hale's face flushed dark against his collar. If you suspect theft, say it plainly. I suspect incompetence, the professor retorted, and I will not have the project jeopardized by a clerk who mistakes a tenor bell for a treble. The Countess's lorgnette flashed again. Gentlemen, please, we are in a cathedral, not a bourse. Mrs. Grayson fluttered forward. Let us go up to the tower. The view is magnificent, and the air will cool tempers. They ascended a spiral stair that smelled of damp stone and candle wax. The higher they climbed, the more the city revealed itself. Red roofs, the silver loop of the river, the masts of ships like a forest of bare spars. In the belfry chamber, the great beams were scarred where the old bells had hung. Iron pins jutted from the walls like broken teeth. A temporary hoist had been rigged. Its ropes coiled neatly around a windlass. Miss Marple paused at a window slit. Far below, the Groenplatz swarmed, with market stalls. A woman in a blue apron was arranging late chrysanthemums. Human life, she reflected, went on much the same whether bells rang or lay shattered. Yet the breaking of a bell, like the breaking of a heart, left fragments that could cut. Behind her, the professor resumed his lecture, pointing out the exact trajectory of the bomb that had silenced the carillon. Mr. Hale stood apart, lighting another cigarette with fingers that trembled slightly. The Countess leaned over the parapet, her sable stole slipping to reveal the pale column of her throat. Mr. Forbes mopped his brow with a silk handkerchief and complained of the climb. A sudden gust of wind swept up the tower, rattling the hoist ropes. One of the crates below shifted with a grating sound, and a single bronze shard slid from its nest to clatter on the chapel flags. The noise echoed upward like a cracked laugh. "Careless!" the professor snapped, though no one had touched the crate. Mr. Hale's cigarette dropped, scattering sparks. "Perhaps the cathedral objects to our prying," he said. Miss Marple turned from the window. "Cathedrals," she said gently, "are remarkably patient. It is people who grow restless when secrets are disturbed." They descended in a silence broken only by the shuffle of feet and the occasional creak of the hoist. In the chapel, the fallen shard lay gleaming amid the straw. The professor stooped to retrieve it, turning it in his hands. A hairline seam glinted along one edge, too straight for bomb damage. "Interesting," he muttered. "This was not catalogued." Mr. Hale peered over his shoulder. "Probably dislodged by the wind. Wind does not file metal," the professor said. He slipped the shard into his pocket, and Miss Marple noticed that his hand closed over it with the unconscious grasp of a man pocketing evidence. Outside, the market bells began to chime the quarter hour, thin and tinny compared to what had once hung above. Mrs. Grayson linked her arm through Miss Marple's as they emerged into the sunlight. "You see, Jane, all this fuss over old bronze, but I confess I shall be glad when the new bells are hung and the old ones forgotten." Miss Marple patted the gloved hand. "Forgotten, my dear Euphemia? I think not. Bronze has a long memory, and so, I fancy, have those who listen to it." The motor car bore them back toward the mere, but Miss Marple's mild blue eyes remained fixed on the cathedral spire until it dwindled behind the rooftops. She was thinking of a cracked bell in Willowbrook whose tongue had been stolen for scrap, and of the verger who had wept, not for the bell, but for what the theft revealed about his neighbour's soul. Some shards, she reflected, are not made of metal at all. Chapter 3. The Foundry at Midnight. The Grayson house settled into the hush that follows a day of too much talk and too little resolution. Dinner had been a strained affair. The professor silent over his soul, Mr. Hale drinking rather more of the excellent Meursault than was prudent, the Countess picking at her food as though suspecting poison in the caper sauce. Mr. Forbes alone had preserved his joviality, but even his anecdotes rang hollow, like a cracked bell refusing to admit its flaw. By 10 o'clock the party had dispersed to their rooms, and the grandfather clock in the hall struck the hour, with the resigned air of a verger who has seen too many quarrels over pew rents. Miss Marple, however, was not asleep. She sat by her bedroom window in a dressing gown of dove-grey wool, her knitting untouched on the table beside her. The curtains were drawn back just enough to reveal a slice of the mere, its gas lamps flickering like uncertain stars. Beyond the rooftops, the foundry chimney rose black against the night sky, and from its throat issued a faint, intermittent glow, orange, then red, then gone. Someone was working late. She had noticed the light an hour earlier, when the house was still murmuring with the small noises of bedtime. A door closing, the creak of Mr. Forbes's bed springs, the soft pad of the maid's slippers on the landing. The glow had appeared first as a mere spark, then steadied into a pulse, as regular as a heartbeat. Miss Marple's mind, trained by years of observing Willowbrook's nocturnal habits, the poacher's lantern, the curate's furtive visits to the widow, refused to dismiss it as mere industry. Foundries, she reflected, did not cast bells by stealth. At length she rose, slipped her feet into felt slippers, and wrapped a dark shawl about her shoulders. The house was silent now, save for the tick of the clock and the occasional groan of old timber. She opened her door with the caution of one who had surprised more than one village maiden in a moonlit garden, and descended the stairs. The hall smelled of beeswax and the dying embers of the drawing-room fire. The front door yielded to her gentle pressure. The latch had not been shot home, a carelessness Mrs. Grayson would deplore in the morning. Outside, the air was sharp with the scent of the river and the faint acrid tang of coal smoke. The mere lay deserted, its cobbles gleaming like fish scales under the lamps. Miss Marple kept to the shadows, moving with the unhurried gait of a woman taking a constitutional, though her eyes were bright and watchful. The foundry lay a mile beyond the cathedral, past the docks where the masts of barges clinked softly in the tide. She followed the line of the old city wall, now half demolished, its stones carted away to mend bomb craters. The glow grew stronger as she approached, and with it came sound, the low roar of a furnace, the clang of metal on metal, a voice raised in anger or exhortation. She could not tell which. The foundry gates stood ajar, a chain dangling loose where the padlock should have been. Miss Marple slipped through and found herself in a courtyard littered with ingots and broken crucibles. The main building loomed ahead, its windows glowing like the eyes of a beast. She skirted a pile of coke and pressed herself against the wall beside an open door. Heat rolled out in waves, carrying the smell of molten bronze and scorched sand. Inside, the scene was one of infernal industry. A great crucible hung suspended over a pit of fire, its contents seething like a witch's cauldron. Two figures moved in the lurid light. Professor Vanderberg, coat discarded, shirt sleeves rolled high, and Mr. Hale, his face streaked with soot. The professor held a shard of bell metal in tongs, examining it against the glare. "You fool," he was saying, his voice pitched low but vibrating with fury. "This cavity was lined with platinum foil. You removed it. Where is it?" Hale's reply was lost in the roar of the furnace, but his gesture was unmistakable. A shrug, half defiance, half fear. He held a small packet wrapped in oilskin, no larger than a matchbox. The professor snatched it, tore it open, and a gleam of white fire spilled into his palm. Diamonds raw and uncut, nestling in a bed of cotton wool. "Smuggled in 44, the professor hissed, hidden in the bells to evade requisition. And you thought to pocket them like a street urchin stealing apples. I needed the money," Hale's voice cracked. "You pay me a pittance while you play the great savant. These stones are worth a fortune, worth your life if the insurers discover the theft." The professor's beard bristled with outrage. "The new bells are to be pure. Every gram of old metal must be accounted for. Return the foil and the stones, or I summon the police." Hale laughed, a bitter sound. "The police, run by the same men who turned a blind eye when the Germans looted the city? You're a hypocrite, Vanderberg. Your own notes mention anomalies in the alloy." "What did you find? Gold from melted Torah ornaments, silver from the cathedral plate." The professor's hand shot out, seizing Hale by the collar. For a moment, the younger man was lifted clear of the ground, his boots scraping the brick floor. Then the professor released him, stepping back as though recoiling from contamination. "Tomorrow," he said, breathing hard, "we melt the shards publicly. Every fragment weighed, every cavity exposed. You will be there to witness your disgrace." Hale straightened his tie, his face pale beneath the soot. "And if I'm not, then I shall know you for a thief and a coward." The professor turned away, dropping the diamonds into a small iron strongbox chained to the wall. He locked it with a key from his waistcoat pocket, then gestured toward the crucible. "Bank the fire. We are done here." Miss Marple withdrew into the shadow of a stack of sand moulds as the men moved toward the door. The professor emerged first, pausing to light a cigar with a spill from the furnace. Hale followed, casting a nervous glance over his shoulder. Neither saw the slight figure in the dark shawl, who watched them pass beneath the lamp and disappear into the night. She waited until the glow in the foundry windows dimmed to a sullen red, then retraced her steps through the courtyard. The chain on the gate had been refastened, but the padlock hung open, careless again, or deliberate. She slipped through and walked briskly back toward the mere, her mind turning over what she had seen like a hand of cards. Diamonds hidden in bells, war loot perhaps, or the desperate hoard of some Jewish family who never returned. The professor's fury had been righteous, yet there was something in his manner, a flicker of calculation, that reminded her of old Mr. Harbottle in Willowbrook, who had denounced the baker for short weight while palming an extra loaf himself. And Hale, his desperation was plain, but desperation, Miss Marple knew, could drive a man to more than theft. The house was still dark when she let herself in. She paused in the hall to listen. A faint snore from Mr. Forbes's room, the creak of a floorboard overhead, someone else awake perhaps. She climbed the stairs softly, her slippers making no sound on the carpet. In her room she lit the gas jet and sat down to her knitting, though her fingers moved mechanically. The wool was a soft grey, the colour of river mist, and as she worked, she reviewed the evening's tableau, the crucible, the diamonds, the strongbox, the key. Somewhere in the house, a door closed with the finality of a judge's gavel. Miss Marple counted her stitches and waited for the next peal in the sequence that had begun with a glow in the night. Chapter 4. The shattering dawn crept over Antwerp like a thief, grey and reluctant, painting the foundry chimney in smears of rose and ash. Miss Marple woke to the sound of raised voices drifting up from the hall. Mrs. Grayson's fluttering tones entangled with the gruff Flemish of policemen. She dressed with her usual precision. A grey wool skirt, a blouse of fine lawn, a cardigan the colour of wood smoke. By the time she descended, the house was transformed into a tableau of tragedy. Constables in peaked caps stationed at the doors, a fingerprint man dusting the telephone table, and Mrs. Grayson collapsed in an armchair, her face the texture of crumpled lace. "Jane! Oh, Jane!" She clutched at Miss Marple's hand as though it were a rosary. "Emile! Dead! Crushed in the foundry, they say. An accident with the mould. But how? The storm last night?" Miss Marple patted the trembling fingers. "Compose yourself, my dear. Details will clarify the picture, as they always do." She turned to the stout figure blocking the drawing-room doorway. Inspector Peter de Vries of the Antwerp Judicial Police. He was built like a Rubens peasant, with a moustache that curled upward like a question mark, and eyes the colour of river mud. "Madame Marple?" The inspector removed his hat, revealing a scalp polished by years of worry. "Madame Grayson speaks highly of your perceptions. I have permitted the household to remain, pending statements. Perhaps you would care to accompany me to the scene." The motor car jolted over rutted lanes, the Scheldt a sullen leaden sheet under a sky still bruised by the night's tempest. The foundry yard was a chaos of officialdom, a cordon of tape, a photographer's flash popping like gunfire, workers huddled in overalled groups murmuring in Flemish. At the centre stood the great mould for the Boden Bell, 6 tons of sand-packed majesty, now toppled on its side. Its collapse had spilled a cascade of half-set bronze, still tacky and steaming in the chill air, mingled with shards of the old Carillon fragments that had been loaded for the poor. And beneath it all, what remained of Professor van der Berg, one arm outstretched as if in benediction, his beard matted with slag, his eyes open to a heaven that had not rung its bells in welcome. Inspector de Vries knelt, gloved hands probing the rubble. "The storm, you see. Winds gusting to 70 kilometres. The scaffold here." He indicated a rickety tower of timber beside the mould, loosened. The whole thing came down at 2 a.m. by the watch in his pocket, stopped at the moment of impact. Miss Marple, invited forward by a nod, circled the wreckage with the air of a gardener surveying storm damage. The spilled metal had cooled into grotesque shapes, fists, faces, a hand grasping at nothing. She stooped to examine the securing rope, a thick hemp hawser, severed midway, its strands fanned out like the petals of a deadly flower. "Curious, Inspector," she said mildly. "This rope shows no fraying from wind or chafe. See, the cut is clean, angled thus." She indicated the bevel with a gentle finger. A sharp blade, wielded with intent, and these footprints in the slag, 2 distinct sets. One heavy, with the tread of a man's boot, the other lighter, narrow-heeled like a lady's shoe. They approach from the gate, circle the mould, and depart in haste toward the river path. The inspector straightened, his moustache quivering. "Madam, you have the eyes of a hawk. But ropes snap in storms. Footprints? Workers, perhaps, come to gawk." "Workers wear clogs, not stilettos," Miss Marple replied. "And why circle? No, these were made before the fall, while the slag was soft." A constable approached, saluting. "The strong-box, Inspector, chained to the wall inside, empty, key in the professor's pocket, but no contents." De Vries swore softly in Flemish. Miss Marple's mind flashed to the midnight crucible, the gleam of diamonds in the professor's palm. Stolen or reclaimed. Back at the Grayson house, the drawing-room served as impromptu tribunal. The remaining guests sat in a semicircle of armchairs, cups of chicory rattling in saucers. Inspector de Vries paced before the mantel, notebook in hand. Professor van der Berg, crushed at approximately 2 a.m., possible. Accident pending inquiry. Alibis, if you please. Countess Petrovna spoke first, her voice steady as Siberian ice. "I slept poorly. Insomnia, a curse of exile. At midnight I took a turn in the garden. The storm drove me back by 1:30. No one can vouch, alas." Mr. Forbes cleared his throat, his watch chain jingling like muted bells. "A night owl, like the Countess. I was deep in a monograph on Fabergé. Insurance valuations, dull but necessary. Retired at 1, slept like the dead." Mr. Hale, pale and hollow-eyed, licked dry lips. "My room, all night. I heard the wind, nothing more. The professor and I worked late yesterday. Argued, yes, but over science, not murder. Mrs. Grayson twisted her handkerchief to threads. I took a second at 11, slept through. Oh, Emile, he was to make the bells sing again. Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting a garter stitch that measured human tension as surely as any barometer. The alibis hung in the air like fog, vague overlapping, none touching the fatal hour. She noted Hale's twitching fingers, the Countess's unblinking stare, Forbes's too-ready smile. The inspector closed his notebook. We shall verify. Meanwhile, no one leaves Antwerp. Madame Grayson, my sympathies and my scrutiny. Lunch was a farce. Cold meats ignored, wine untasted. Afterward, Miss Marple drew Mrs. Grayson aside in the morning room, where ferns drooped in brass pots like weary conspirators. Euphemia, she said gently, the professor confided in you? Tears welled anew. Only that the fragments held secrets, war diamonds hidden by my husband for safekeeping. Emile was authenticating for the insurers. He suspected Lucienne of pilfering, but swore it was a trifle that could topple moulds, Miss Marple murmured. Tell me, did your husband ever mention a partner in the trade? Someone with access to the foundry? Mrs. Grayson frowned. Reginald Forbes? No, Reginald is art, not gems, though he knew Father Grayson slightly. Miss Marple nodded, filing the connection. In Willowbrook, the butcher who decried high prices had once been caught palming cuts from the squire's herd. Motives overlapped like ivy. That afternoon, word came from the foundry. A bell shard missing from the recasting pile, one with the suspicious seam the professor had pocketed in the cathedral. Replaced perhaps by a lump of plain bronze. Evening brought rain, drumming on the panes like impatient fingers. The inspector returned, face grimmer. The rope cut with a diamond saw, tool for gem work, and fibres on it match a glove found in the yard. Ladies, black kid, size 6. The Countess's hand flew to her throat, emeralds dull in the lamplight. Hale bolted upright. Not hers! She was enough! De Vries barked. Miss Marple laid aside her needles. Inspector, if I might suggest, examine the river path for a discarded heel, or a glove that no longer fits. He eyed her, shrewdly. You will consult, madam? With pleasure, she replied. Murder, like a flawed bell, rings false to those who listen. As the house lights dimmed, Miss Marple retired, but sleep evaded her. Through the window, lightning etched the cathedral spire, and thunder rolled like the death knell of the Borden. The shattering had begun. Now came the echoes that would name the striker. Chapter 5. Threads of Motive. The rain that had begun at dusk thickened into a steady Flemish downpour, drumming on the slate roof of the Grayson house, like the impatient fingers of a creditor. By morning, the gutters ran brown. The mare was a canal of umbriels, and the drawing-room fire hissed whenever a drop found the chimney. The party assembled for a late breakfast with the air of mourners at a wake where the corpse has not yet been identified. Countess Petrovna wore black from throat to hem, her emeralds replaced by jet. Mr. Forbes's waistcoat strained over a stomach unsettled by chicory and suspicion. Mr. Hale had not appeared at all. Mrs. Grayson, pale but composed, presided over the coffee pot with the mechanical grace of a marionette. The inspector telephoned, she announced. The inquest is set for tomorrow. Meanwhile, we are to remain indoors. Jane, will you take a cup? Miss Marple accepted, adding precisely the amount of milk she preferred. Indoors is wise, Euphemia. Wet pavements wash away footprints, and we have need of every clue. A knock at the street door admitted Inspector de Vries, dripping like a seal. He refused coffee but accepted a chair by the fire. "News," he said without preamble. "The missing shard, found at dawn, floating in the Scheldt near the Steen. Weighted with lead, but the current freed it. The cavity inside had been pried open. Traces of platinum foil remain. Also, a lady's glove, Black Kid monogrammed IP, caught on a mooring post. The Countess's cup rattled in its saucer. "Initials are common," she said. "I have lost no glove." "Yet the mate was discovered in your wastebasket, Countess," de Vries replied. "Torn, as though snatched from a thorn bush. And your maid confirms you returned to your room at 1:30, mud on your hem." Mr. Forbes cleared his throat noisily. "Mud proves nothing. Antwerp is built on it." "True," the inspector conceded, "but the diamond saw used on the rope matches a set registered to your firm, Mr. Forbes. Lent to the foundry for alloy tests, you said." Forbes's jowls darkened. "Lent, yes. Misplaced, possibly. I am not a locksmith." Miss Marple set her cup aside. "Misplacement is a fertile excuse, Mr. Forbes. In Willowbrook, a missing church key was blamed on the verger's cat until the cat was found locked in the vestry." Mrs. Grayson gave a small, hysterical laugh that died against the walls. "This is absurd. We are guests, not criminals." "Guests with motives," de Vries said. He produced a folded paper, a telegram intercepted at the post office, addressed to Mr. Hale. "Sell the stones tonight or face ruin. F. Sent from London yesterday." Silence fell, thick as the steam from the coffee pot. Then the door opened, and Hale himself appeared, unshaven, eyes red-rimmed. "I heard my name," he said hoarsely. "The telegram is mine. Debts, cards, horses, a woman in Brussels. The professor knew. He threatened exposure unless I repaid every franc from the sale of fragments." "Fragments you sold," de Vries pounced. "3 small ones," Hale admitted, "to a dealer in Amsterdam. I needed the money, but murder? No, I was in my room." "Alone," the inspector observed. "And the strong box key was found bent in the professor's pocket, as though forced." Miss Marple rose and crossed to the window, where rain streaked the glass like tears. "Let us consider the threads," she said, half to herself. "The professor intended a public melting, every shard weighed, every secret exposed. That threatened several interests." She turned, mild eyes sweeping the room. "Countess, your emeralds are magnificent, yet I notice the clasp is new. Replaced, perhaps, after a stone was pried loose to purchase silence. Mr. Forbes, your firm insures the new bells for a fortune. Exposure of smuggled diamonds would void the policy and ruin your reputation. Mr. Hale, your debts are a noose, and Euphemia," she paused, gentle but inexorable. "Your late husband hid gems in the bells during the war. If discovered, the Belgian authorities might claim them as national treasure, leaving you penniless." Mrs. Grayson pressed a hand to her heart. "Arthur acted to save the business. The Germans would have taken everything." "Quite," Miss Marple said, "but the professor's scruples were inconvenient." The inspector nodded slowly. "Motive enough for conspiracy. Yet only 1 or 2 struck the blow. That afternoon, while the rain eased to a drizzle, Miss Marple requested permission to examine the guests' rooms. De Vries, intrigued, accompanied her. In the Countess's chamber they found a locked jewel case. The key, on a ribbon round her neck, opened to reveal a compartment lined with empty velvet depressions shaped for stones no longer there. In Forbes's portmanteau, beneath folded linen, lay a ledger, entries in red ink, sums owing to a London moneylender, the last dated 3 days ago. Hale's room yielded a half-empty bottle of Veronal and a letter from the Brussels woman, threats of exposure. Mrs. Grayson's room was last. In a cedar chest at the bed's foot, wrapped in tissue, lay a small canvas pouch. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside, 3 rough diamonds, each the size of a pea, and a note in a spidery hand, for Euphemia, if the bells fail. A.G. The widow sank onto the bed. "Arthur's insurance," she whispered. "He told me to melt them into the new alloy if necessary. Emile refused, said it was sacrilege." De Vries pocketed the pouch. "Evidence, madame, and motive." Tea was served in the library, where atlases and bound volumes of the connoisseur gathered dust. The Countess sat rigid, jet beads clicking. Forbes puffed a cigar despite Mrs. Grayson's protests. Hale stared at the carpet as though it might open and swallow him. Miss Marple poured tea with the calm of a priest dispensing communion. "Curious," she mused aloud, "how greed disguises itself. The Countess needs funds to maintain her exile in style. Mr. Forbes protects his commission. Mr. Hale escapes ruin. Mrs. Grayson preserves her inheritance. Yet only one, or two, crossed the line from desire to deed." The inspector entered, raindrops glittering on his shoulders. "The foundry worker arrested yesterday for theft has confessed to selling bronze scraps, but swears he saw lights in the casting shed at 1 a.m. 2 figures, one tall, one slight. They argued, then the mould rocked." "2," Miss Marple repeated softly, as the footprints suggested. Evening brought a fresh development. A boy from the telegraph office delivered a second message, this one to Forbes. "Shipment delayed. Hold the stones, The initials matched the Countess's monogram. Forbes blustered. "A coincidence, I know no I." But the Countess rose, regal even in defeat. "Enough. The stones were to be split. My share for silence. Reginald's for insurance fraud." We went together to reason with Emile. He laughed, said the melting would proceed at dawn, public, irreversible. Lucien followed us, begging. When Emile turned to lock the strongbox, Reginald pushed the scaffold. The mould fell. Lucien screamed and ran. I stood frozen. Then we fled. Hale lurched to his feet. "You used me! The telegram was to flush you out," Forbes admitted heavily. "We needed a scapegoat." Mrs. Grayson began to weep, softly, steadily. Miss Marple laid a hand on her shoulder. "The bells will ring pure now, Euphemia. Some secrets are best melted away." Inspector de Vries snapped handcuffs on the Countess and Forbes. Hale was led away for questioning. The rain had stopped. Through the window, the cathedral spire caught the last light, clean against the clearing sky. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. The threads were gathered. The pattern, though tangled, was complete. Chapter 6. The Chime of Deception. The arrests of Countess Petrovna and Mr. Forbes had the effect of a cracked bell struck too hard. The house rang with shock, then fell into a stunned, hollow silence. Mrs. Grayson moved through the rooms like a ghost in her own home, touching the backs of chairs as though to assure herself they were still there. The maids whispered in the pantry. The grandfather clock ticked louder, as if counting down to some final peal. Inspector de Vries had departed with his prisoners, promising a full report after the inquest, but the air remained thick with questions no confession had answered. Miss Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting needles clicking with the calm precision of a metronome. The wool was a soft, heathery blue now, the colour of the Scheldt at twilight. She had asked for the morning post to be brought unopened. Among the black-bordered envelopes of condolence lay a single sheet of cheap paper, folded small and addressed in a clerk's hand to Monsieur L. Hale. It had been delivered by hand, the maid said, by a boy who vanished before questions could be asked. She slit the seal with a silver knife. The message was brief: Dock 17, midnight. Bring the foil. No police, or you join the professor. V. Miss Marple folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. Mr. Hale had been released on condition he remain in Antwerp. The inspector, satisfied with the Countess's confession, had judged him a dupe rather than a murderer. Yet, dupe or not, the net was tightening. At luncheon, cold tongue and cress sandwiches no one tasted, Mrs. Grayson announced that the cathedral chapter had postponed the first pouring of the new bells until the inquest. "They fear scandal," she said, her voice thin, as though bronze cares for human folly. "Bronze is innocent," Miss Marple replied. "It is the hand that stirs the crucible that sins." Afterward, she sought out Hale in the library, where he sat hunched over a brandy he had not touched. The room smelled of leather and old cigar smoke. Dust motes drifted in the slanted light like tiny aimless souls. "You have a rendezvous tonight, Mr. Hale," she said without preamble, producing the note. He started, slopping brandy onto the blotter. "How? That was private. Privacy is a luxury murder denies us." She sat opposite, folding her hands. "Who is V?" "I don't know." His voice cracked. "A middleman, perhaps. The professor mentioned a contact in the diamond trade. Someone who supplied the platinum foil during the war. I thought the note was from Forbes, but he's in a cell." "Or from someone Forbes trusted." Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but inexorable. "You sold fragments, yes, but the platinum lining was the true prize. It could be melted into the new bells, laundered as alloy. Tell me, did the Countess know of this V?" Hale rubbed his temples. "She hinted at a silent partner. Said if I played my part, my debts would vanish. I thought it was bluff. Bluff becomes murder when the stakes are high enough." She leaned forward. "Will you keep the appointment?" "I must. If there's a chance to recover the foil, you will recover a noose." Miss Marple rose. "Leave this to the inspector, and to me." That evening the sky cleared to a hard starlit frost. The city's gas lamps flickered like wary eyes. The cathedral spire stood black against the Milky Way. At 11 o'clock Miss Marple donned her dark shawl and slipped out by the garden door, leaving Mrs. Grayson dozing over her embroidery. She walked briskly, keeping to the shadows until the docks opened before her. A forest of masts, the slap of water against piles, the smell of tar and rotting fish. Dock 17 lay at the far end, where the newer warehouses loomed. A single lantern swung from a crane, its beam cutting a slow arc across the cobbles. Hale was already there, coat collar turned up, pacing like a trapped animal. Miss Marple watched from behind a stack of crates as a figure detached itself from the darkness, slight, cloaked, hood drawn close. A woman's voice, low and urgent. "The foil, Lucien, now! I haven't got it!" Hale's whisper carried on the cold air. "The police!" A gloved hand flashed, steel glinted. Hale stumbled back against a bollard. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice clear as a church bell at matins. "Drop the knife, Mrs. Grayson." The hooded figure whirled. Euphemia Grayson's face was chalk white beneath the hood, her eyes wild, the knife, a slim diamond cutter's blade, trembled in her grip. "Jane, this is not—" "It is exactly what it appears." Miss Marple advanced steadily. "You arranged the midnight meeting with the professor to plead for the diamonds. When he refused, you cut the rope. The Countess and Forbes were decoys, witnesses to muddy the waters. You sent the telegrams, forged the initials, and tonight you meant to silence the last loose tongue." Hale stared, comprehension dawning like frost. "You, Euphemia? But Arthur's gems were never Arthur's to keep." Mrs. Grayson's voice shook. "He stole them from a Jewish partner who vanished in 43. I found the ledger after his death. Emile was going to expose everything in the public melt. I couldn't lose the house, the name." Footsteps echoed on the cobbles. Inspector de Vries and 2 constables, summoned by a note Miss Marple had left on the inspector's desk. The knife clattered to the ground. Mrs. Grayson sagged, caught by the arms. Back in the warm lamplight of the mere, the full pattern emerged. Mrs. Grayson had worn her maid's cloak and boots to the foundry, leaving the Countess's glove as a blind. Forbes had lent the diamond saw unwittingly. The Countess had agreed to the scheme for a share that never materialized. Hale's debts made him the perfect scapegoat. The missing shard in the river had been weighted by Mrs. Grayson herself. A final misdirection. At dawn the next day, the inquest returned a verdict of willful murder against Euphemia Grayson, with Petrovna and Forbes as accessories. The diamonds, those remaining, were surrendered to the state for restitution. The cathedral chapter announced the pouring would proceed, the alloy now certified pure. Miss Marple stood in the foundry yard as the crucible was tilted. Molten bronze flowed like liquid sunlight into the mould, hissing and glowing. The air shimmered with heat, and the faint, sweet smell of rebirth. When the metal cooled, the new Borden would hang her. Its predecessor had fallen, its voice untainted by the secrets that had shattered the old. She turned away as the workers cheered the first steam. Human bells, she reflected, were less easily recast. Chapter 7. The Final Peal. The inquest was held in the great hall of the Palais de Justice, a cavern of marble and echoing footsteps where justice had been dispensed since the days of the Spanish governors. By 9 o'clock the public benches were packed. Diamond merchants in fur-collared coats, cathedral canons in rusty black, reporters with notebooks poised like bayonets. Sunlight slanted through high windows, striping the floor with gold bars that seemed to imprison the accused. Mrs. Euphemia Grayson sat between 2 gendarmes, smaller than anyone remembered, her veil drawn close. Countess Petrovna beside her stared straight ahead, chin high, as though exile had prepared her for any scaffold. Mr. Forbes occupied the end of the bench, waistcoat unbuttoned, the watch chain that had once proclaimed prosperity, now dangling like a broken bell-pull. Mr. Hale, released but not exonerated, stood at the rear, hands clasped behind him, as if still manacled. Miss Marple took a seat near the front, her grey gloves folded neatly in her lap. She had been called as a witness for the Crown. Inspector de Vries had insisted, with the gruff respect of a man who had seen a miracle, and prefers not to admit it. The coroner, a thin man with a voice like dry leaves, opened proceedings. Evidence was presented with Flemish thoroughness. The severed rope, the diamond saw, the weighted shard dredged from the Scheldt, the forged telegrams, the pouch of stones from Mrs. Grayson's cedar chest. Each item was passed along the jury box. handled with the reverence usually reserved for relics. Mrs. Grayson's confession, taken down in the cold hours before dawn, was read aloud. She had gone to the foundry at 1 o'clock, cloaked in the maid's garments, to plead with Professor van der Berg. He had refused to yield the diamonds or suppress the public melting. In the struggle over the strongbox key, she had seized the saw, left on a bench after alloy tests, and slashed the scaffold rope. The mould had toppled with a roar that drowned her scream. Panic had sent her fleeing. Later, in the dark of her room, she had planted the Countess's glove and sent the telegrams to scatter blame. The Countess, questioned, admitted complicity in the scheme but denied striking the blow. "I went to watch, nothing more. Euphemia acted alone." Her voice carried the chill of the steps. Forbes blustered that he had been duped, promised a share for lending the saw, never dreaming of murder. Hale, pale and trembling, swore he had run from the foundry in terror, believing the Professor already dead. The coroner turned to Miss Marple. "You, madame, were instrumental in unravelling this tangle. Pray tell the court how you discerned the truth." Miss Marple rose, small and erect, her voice clear enough to reach the back benches. "It began with discrepancies, sir. The footprints in the slag, one heavy, one light. Yet the Countess's boots, when measured, were a size too large for the prints. The glove found in the yard was torn on the palm, as though used to grip a rough rope, but the Countess's hands are smooth, uncalloused. Then the telegrams. The paper was from the Grayson household stock, the ink from Mrs. Grayson's own desk. Finally, the note luring Mr. Hale to the dock, written in a hand I recognized from Euphemia's grocery lists. She paused, letting the silence settle. Murder, like a flawed bell, rings false to the attentive ear. Mrs. Grayson loved her husband's memory too fiercely to let it be tarnished. When the Professor threatened exposure, she struck, not in rage, but in a kind of desperate loyalty. The others were accomplices after the fact, drawn by greed into a web they mistook for silk. The jury retired for 19 minutes. When they returned, the foreman pronounced willful murder against Euphemia Grayson, accessories before and after the fact against Irina Petrovna and Reginald Forbes. Hale was bound over for receiving stolen goods, but released on condition he leave Antwerp within the week. Outside, the October sun had broken through, gilding the cathedral spire. The first trial pouring of the new Borden was scheduled for noon. The city had declared a half-holiday, and crowds gathered in the Groenplatz with picnic baskets and children on shoulders. Miss Marple walked with Inspector de Vries to the foundry. The great mould stood upright again, its surface polished smooth. Workers in leather aprons fed the furnace. The air shimmered with heat and the smell of molten metal. At the stroke of 12, the crucible was tilted. Bronze flowed in a golden river, filling the mould with a hiss and a roar that rose to a triumphant note. When the stream ceased, a cheer went up. The master founder struck a small handbell. Its pure tone floated over the yard, clear as spring water. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, hearing in it the echo of every village bell she had ever known, calling to worship, tolling for the dead, marking the quiet passages of ordinary lives. Mrs. Grayson had been taken away in a closed van. The Countess and Forbes would follow at dusk. The diamonds, catalogued and sealed, awaited claimants who might never come. Antwerp would ring again, cleansed of its wartime secrets. Inspector de Vries offered his arm as they left the yard. "You will return to England, madame?" "Tomorrow," Miss Marple replied. "There is a train at 10. Willowbrook will seem very quiet after all this clamour." He smiled, the moustache lifting. "Quiet is underrated. Yet I think you carry the clamour with you, in here." He tapped his temple. "Perhaps," she said, "but clamour, properly sorted, becomes harmony." That evening she packed her small valise, folding the heathery blue knitting into a neat square. Mrs. Grayson's maid, tearful, pressed a parcel into her hands, a tiny bronze bell, cast from the dross of the old carillon. Its tongue a single diamond chip surrendered by the police. For remembrance, the note read, in a hand already shaking toward prison bars. Miss Marple slipped it into her pocket. On the morning train, as Antwerp receded behind lace curtains of mist, she took it out and rang it once. The note was sweet, almost apologetic, as though the metal itself regretted the blood it had carried. She smiled, tucked it away, and opened her newspaper to the crossword. The bells of home were waiting, and there was always another puzzle to solve. Chapter 8. Return to Quietude. The Brussels express pulled out of Antwerp Central at 10 o'clock precisely, its whistle a brief, polite farewell that dissolved into the clatter of wheels on rails. Miss Marple sat by the window in a first-class compartment, scented faintly with coal smoke and orange peel. Outside, the flat Flemish landscape unrolled like a bolt of drab velvet. Poplars in windbreak lines, red-roofed farms, canals glinting on under a sky the colour of pewter. She had declined the porter's offer of tea. English railways were one thing, Belgian quite another, and instead opened her small leather writing case. A single sheet of deckle-edged paper lay ready. She took up her fountain pen and began in her neat slanting hand a letter to her nephew Raymond. "My dear Raymond, the Antwerp affair is concluded, though concluded is perhaps too tidy a word for the untidiness of human hearts. The bells will ring again at Christmas, pure bronze and honest tone, and the city will forget the blood that cooled beneath the mould. I shall not. One remembers not to brood, but to measure how little the years change us." She paused, watching a heron lift from a dike, wings slow as forgiveness. The tiny bronze bell lay in her lap, wrapped in cotton wool. She had not decided whether to keep it or drop it into the Thames from Westminster Bridge. Some souvenirs are best surrendered to running water. At Brussels Midi, she changed for the Ostend boat train. The crossing was calm, the channel a sheet of hammered silver under a pale November sun. On deck she encountered a party of Belgian schoolchildren returning from a London excursion. Their laughter rang across the water like a peal of new bells, and she found herself smiling at the sound. Children, she reflected, were the only reliable alloy against despair. Willowbrook greeted her with the familiar smell of wood smoke and wet leaves. The station fly deposited her at the lich gate just as the church clock struck 4. Mrs. Price from the post office was there, arms folded under her apron, eyes bright with questions she would not ask until invited. "Welcome home, Miss Marple. Terrible business abroad, they say." "Terrible anywhere, Mrs. Price, but the garden needs attention, and the vicarage tea is at past." She walked up, the lane between clipped yews, past cottages where curtains twitched and dogs barked in cheerful recognition. Her own gate stood open. The maid, young Doris, had set a vase of chrysanthemums on the hall table and left a note. "Kettle on, miss. cake in tin, the simplicity of it brought a lump to her throat sharper than any cathedral requiem. That evening the vicar called, ostensibly to return a book on campanology borrowed 6 months earlier. He lingered over seed catalogues and parish accounts until Miss Marple poured a second cup of tea and fixed him with her mildest gaze. "You wish to know about the murder, Mr. Clement?" "Well, parishioners do ask, and the newspapers were vague." She told him not the lurid details, but the shape of it. Greed disguised as loyalty, desperation wearing the mask of elegance. A woman who loved a dead man more than the living. The vicar listened, turning his cup in scholarly circles. "And the bells?" he asked at last. "Will ring true. Bronze forgets. People must learn to." He left with the promise of a cutting of Mrs. Marple's white chrysanthemums for the churchyard. She watched him go, then took the little bronze bell from her pocket and set it on the mantel beside the Willowbrook bell ring, a plain iron thing that had summoned the faithful for 2 centuries. The 2 bells side by side looked like mother and child. Later, in the lamplit sitting room, she finished her letter to Raymond. "I have brought back a small bell, cast from the old Carolyn's dross. It will hang in the porch and tinkle when the wind is right. A reminder that even shattered things may be recast if the fire is hot enough and the hand steady. Give my love to Joan and the boys. Tell them Granny has solved another puzzle and is ready for the next." She sealed the envelope, addressed it, and placed it on the hall table for morning collection. Then she took up her knitting, socks for the Belgian Refugee Fund, a practical charity, and worked steadily until the fire burned low. Outside, the village settled into its winter rhythm. A dog barking, a gate creaking, the faint chime of the church clock marking the half-hour. Miss Marple paused, needle-stilled. Somewhere in the distance, the new Antwerp carillon was being tuned, its voice travelling across seas and years to mingle with the quiet bells of home. She listened until the notes faded, then resumed her knitting, counting stitches with the patience of one who knows that every pattern, however tangled, resolves in the end. The fire settled into embers. The socks grew, row by row, and in the porch the little bronze bell stirred in a draught, giving one clear, apologetic note before falling silent again.